Let me start with a statement that usually triggers pushback, not because it's wrong, but because it forces people to confront something they'd rather not. If you're spending $40 a bottle on antioxidant pills, superfood capsules, or doctor-formulated extracts, you not buying health, you buying permission to stop questioning the system that sold them to you. That might sound harsh, but it comes from experience. Years of watching the same cycle repeat. A new ingredient gets crowned the next big thing. A handful of studies get cherry-picked. Influencers echo the same phrases word for word. Packaging gets sleeker, language gets more technical, and prices quietly rise. Meanwhile, the actual results most people get remain flat. No real change in energy. No noticeable improvement in recovery. No measurable shift in how they feel day to day. I know this because I've been on both sides of it. I've bought the hype. I've tested the expensive stuff. I've run comparisons over time, not once, not casually, but consistently enough to see patterns emerge. And one pattern shows up over and over again. The more aggressively a product is marketed, the less likely it is to be the best option available. That's not an accident. It's a business model. The supplement industry doesn't get rewarded for effectiveness. It gets rewarded for scalability. The easier something is to standardize, brand, encapsulate, and ship, the more attractive it becomes regardless of whether it's the most powerful option. This is why entire categories of plants with real biological impact get sidelined. Not because they don't work, but because they're bitter, unfamiliar, hard to market, or impossible to turn into a recurring monthly purchase. Most people assume that if something truly worked, it would be everywhere. That logic sounds reasonable, but it falls apart the moment you understand incentives. What gets promoted isn't what's best for your body, it's what's best for margins. Price becomes a proxy for quality. Popularity becomes a stand-in for effectiveness. And slowly, without realizing it, people start trusting labels more than outcomes. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Some of the most powerful foods on this planet never became trends because they don't need processing. They don't need isolation, and they don't need a marketing narrative to justify their existence. They work as whole foods in their natural form, without asking for brand loyalty. And from a profit standpoint, that's a dead end. So instead of being elevated, they're quietly ignored, not attacked, not debunked. Just left out of the conversation entirely, which is often the biggest red flag of all. What this video is about is pulling back that curtain. Not with conspiracy theatrics, but with hard-earned perspective. The kind you only get after seeing what actually delivers results once the hype wears off. Because when you strip away marketing trends and price tags, a very different hierarchy of superfoods starts to appear. And when you understand that hierarchy, you stop asking what's new, what's expensive, or what everyone else is buying. You start asking a much more dangerous question. What have I been ignoring? That question leads directly to a plant most people have never been encouraged to eat, despite the fact that it quietly outperforms one of America's most celebrated health foods. The plant that forces that uncomfortable question into the open is aronia berry, often called chokeberry. And before you dismiss it because the name doesn't sound exciting, understand this. Obscurity in nutrition is not a measure of weakness. Very often, it's a measure of inconvenience. Aronia berry doesn't have the soft sweetness people expect from fruit. It doesn't fit neatly into smoothies without overpowering everything else. It doesn't feel indulgent. It tastes medicinal, bitter, dry, almost aggressive. And that single fact explains more about why it never went mainstream than any conspiracy theory ever could. But when you look past flavor and focus on function, aronia becomes impossible to ignore. On paper, its antioxidant density doesn't just rival blueberries, it surpasses them. In multiple analyses, aronia berry ranks among the highest foods ever tested for total polyphenol content. Its anthocyanin concentration, the compounds responsible for deep red and purple pigments and many protective effects in the body, is dramatically higher than what you'll find in blueberries, blackberries, or even acai. What makes this especially important is not just the quantity, but the structure of those compounds. The anthocyanins in aronia are unusually stable. They don't degrade as easily during digestion, which means a higher percentage actually survives long enough to do something useful inside the body. That's a detail almost no marketing label talks about, but it's everything when it comes to real-world results. This is why researchers didn't stumble onto aronia recently. It's been studied quietly for decades, particularly in Eastern Europe and parts of Scandinavia, where it was used traditionally not as a snack, but as a functional food. Something consumed with intention, not casually, because people understood it was potent. And potency changes how something gets treated by the market. You don't sell potent things easily to a mass audience. You have to explain them. You have to educate people. You have to deal with the fact that they don't taste like candy and don't produce instant gratification. And in an industry driven by speed, scale, and repeat purchases, that's friction no one wants. So instead of being elevated, aronia berries stayed in the background, known to researchers, known to certain traditional food cultures, known to a small number of people who cared more about function than flavor. And here's the part that should make you pause. If a plant this powerful never needed a marketing push to earn its reputation in scientific circles, what does that say about the products that do? That's the question we'll start answering next. When we look at why blueberries became America's antioxidant icon, and why that story is far more about economics than biology. Blueberries didn't become America's antioxidant darling because they were the most powerful option available. They became famous because they were the most convenient one. Convenient to grow, convenient to sell, convenient to sweeten, and convenient to build an entire health narrative around without asking consumers to change their habits. Blueberries taste good. That matters more than most people realize. They're easy to eat by the handful, easy to blend into smoothies, easy to hide in cereals, yogurts, muffins, bars, and health snacks. That palatability made them the perfect ambassador for antioxidant messaging. You didn't have to educate people. You just had to reassure them that something they already enjoyed was now officially good for them. Aronia berry never had that advantage. Its flavor is intense, almost confrontational. The bitterness and dryness aren't to flaws, they re-signals of high polyphenol content, but from a mass market perspective, they're liabilities. You can't casually sprinkle aronia into processed foods without changing the entire product profile. And once a food requires explanation instead of instant pleasure, most companies move on. There's also the issue of control. Blueberries scale beautifully in industrial agriculture. They respond well to selective breeding, monocropping, and global distribution. That makes them predictable. Predictability is gold in the food system. Aronia, by contrast, thrives in smaller-scale cultivation and doesn't lend itself as easily to the same level of commercial manipulation. Then there's marketing optics. Blueberries look friendly, bright, inviting. Aronia looks dark, almost black, with a name that literally includes the word choke. That alone is enough to derail a branding meeting. So what happened was inevitable. Blueberries became the face of antioxidants. They were studied heavily, promoted aggressively, and woven into public health messaging. Over time, the story hardened into blueberries equal top-tier health food, even as research quietly identified other plants with far greater biological impact. This isn't an attack on blueberries. They're fine, they're useful. They're just not the final boss they're often portrayed to be. And once you understand that fame in nutrition is often about economics, not effectiveness, the rise of blueberries and the silence around aronia berries starts to make uncomfortable sense. Because when attention follows profit, power doesn't always follow attention. Once you strip away branding, popularity, and feel-good health headlines, what actually matters is how a plant behaves inside the body. This is where aronia berry separates itself from almost everything it gets compared to. Most foods marketed as antioxidant-rich rely on one or two standout compounds and call it a day. Aronia, on the other hand, delivers a dense and unusually diverse polyphenol profile. That diversity matters because oxidative stress in the body isn't a single problem with a single solution. It's a network of reactions happening in different tissues, at different times, under different conditions. Broad-spectrum protection consistently outperforms isolated compounds, and aronia naturally provides that spectrum. One of the key differences is its anthocyanin structure. The anthocyanins in aronia berry are not only present in higher concentrations, they're more resilient. Many antioxidant compounds degrade quickly during digestion, meaning what looks impressive on a label never fully makes it into circulation. Aronia's compounds show greater stability, allowing more of their protective potential to actually be utilized by the body. There's also the interaction effect most supplement marketing ignores. In whole foods like aronia, compounds don't work in isolation. They reinforce each other. Polyphenols, flavonoids, and organic acids interact in ways isolated extracts simply can't replicate. This is one of the reasons whole plant consumption often produces more noticeable, consistent results than even high-dose supplements. From a physiological standpoint, this translates into better modulation of oxidative stress, more balanced inflammatory signaling, and improved support for vascular function. These aren't flashy claims. They're foundational processes. And foundational processes are what determine long-term outcomes, not short-term hype. This is also why people who use Aronia berry consistently tend to report subtle but meaningful changes over time, rather than dramatic overnight effects. Better recovery. More stable energy. Less systemic inflammation creeping in unnoticed. The kind of improvements that don't go viral, but do add up. And here's the important part. None of this requires megadosing. In fact, small, regular exposure to dense plant compounds almost always outperforms occasional high-dose interventions. Aronia fits that model perfectly, which again makes it powerful but inconvenient for an industry built on selling more, not smarter. This is the point where a lot of people get defensive, and that reaction alone tells you how deeply conditioned we've become. The moment someone questions supplements, especially expensive ones, it feels personal, because money was spent. Trust was given, hope was invested. And nobody likes being told they may have been chasing the wrong solution. But if you zoom out and look at the pattern honestly, it becomes hard to ignore. The modern supplement industry is built around one core assumption, that health needs to be concentrated, simplified, and swallowed. That assumption sounds logical in a fast-paced society, but it quietly breaks down the moment you understand how human biology actually works. Pills are not neutral. The way compounds are isolated, stabilized, and delivered changes how the body responds to them. And in many cases, it dramatically reduces their real-world impact. Most antioxidant supplements start with a promising plant or compound. Then the process begins. Active ingredients are isolated. Supporting compounds are stripped away. Fillers are added to stabilize production. Dosages are standardized to fit capsules, not bodies. What remains is something that looks powerful on a label but behaves very differently once it enters your system. This is where people get confused. They see milligram counts and assume higher equals better. They see words like clinical, pharmaceutical grade, or doctor formulated, and assume superiority. But those labels describe manufacturing, not effectiveness. Biology doesn't care how clean your capsule looks. It cares how compounds interact, how they're absorbed, and how they signal inside the body. Whole plants like Aronia berry don't deliver single compounds in isolation. They deliver ecosystems. Polyphenols, anthocyanins, organic acids, and cofactors arrive together, in ratios shaped by evolution, not marketing departments. That matters because many beneficial compounds are not designed to work alone. They protect each other during digestion. They enhance absorption. They modulate each other's effects. Remove that context, and you don't get a stronger result, you often get a weaker one. This is one of the reasons people take expensive antioxidant supplements for months and feel nothing. Not because antioxidants don't matter, but because the delivery system is fundamentally flawed. The body recognizes whole food signals. It struggles with isolated fragments pretending to be substitutes. Another layer most people never consider is motivation. Supplements are rarely sold as temporary tools. They're framed as ongoing necessities. Take daily. Use consistently. Don't stop. Not because your body requires lifelong supplementation, but because recurring consumption is good for business. The goal is retention, not resolution. Whole foods don't behave that way. When used properly, they integrate into a diet without escalating dependence. There's no pressure to increase dosage. No fear-based messaging about stopping, no upgrade cycle. And from a business standpoint, that's a problem. This is where the $40 price point becomes revealing. That number isn't random. It sits right at the edge of what most people will tolerate monthly without demanding dramatic results. It feels premium, but not outrageous. High enough to imply quality. Low enough to justify repetition. That price has nothing to do with the cost of ingredients and everything to do with psychology. Meanwhile, plants like Aronia berry quietly exist outside that system. They don't require encapsulation. They don't benefit from isolation. They don't improve when stripped down. In fact, they lose their advantage when you try to turn them into pills. Which means their most effective form is also their least profitable one. That creates an uncomfortable dynamic. If the best version of something can't be monetized efficiently, it won't be promoted aggressively. It won't be featured in top 10 lists. It won't be pushed by influencers whose income depends on affiliate links. It won't be demonized either because attacking it draws attention, Instead, it gets ignored. Silence is safer than debate. Another truth people rarely hear is that many symptoms attributed to low antioxidants are actually signs of inconsistent exposure to protective foods. People supplement sporadically. They skip doses. They change brands. They stack products. All of that creates noise. Whole foods reward consistency, not optimization. Small amounts, taken regularly, tend to outperform aggressive interventions taken occasionally. This is why people who incorporate dense plants like aronia berry into their routine often describe the effects as subtle but unmistakable. Not dramatic spikes, but smoother baselines. Less inflammation quietly accumulating. Better recovery that doesn't demand attention. Improvements that don't scream for validation but become noticeable once they're gone. And here's where the narrative really breaks down. If pills truly worked better than plants, there would be no reason for traditional diets to emphasize whole foods so heavily. Cultures across history would have evolved extraction and isolation as their default. They didn't. They relied on bitter plants, dark berries, roots, and leaves often in small amounts because those foods communicated with human biology in a way isolated compounds never fully replicated. Modern supplements didn't replace that wisdom because they were superior. They replaced it because they were convenient, scalable, and profitable. That distinction matters. This isn't an argument against all supplements. There are contexts where they make sense. Deficiencies, acute needs, specific conditions. But using $40 antioxidant pills as a stand-in for dense whole plants is not optimization. It's outsourcing responsibility to a label. And once you see that, the frustration many people feel starts to make sense. They weren't failing the supplements. The supplements were failing to deliver what whole foods already knew how to provide. Which brings us to an uncomfortable realization. A plant like aronia berry doesn't just compete with supplements. It exposes the limitations of the entire model they're built on. And that's why it doesn't get a spotlight. There's a specific kind of discomfort that shows up whenever a plant like aronia berry enters the conversation, and it has nothing to do with safety, taste, or even science. It's the discomfort that comes from something quietly breaking the rules without asking permission. Aronia doesn't challenge the wellness industry loudly. It doesn't attack it. It simply exists as proof that many of the assumptions people have been sold for years aren't as solid as they thought. When a whole plant, consumed consistently and without modification, can rival or outperform products that took millions of dollars to develop, market, and distribute, it creates an awkward comparison. Not because the plant is magical, but because it reveals how much complexity has been added where it wasn't needed. And complexity is where a lot of money hides. The modern wellness space is structured around improvement narratives. Everything is supposed to be upgraded, enhanced, optimized, or engineered. New formulations imply progress. New discoveries imply that what came before was incomplete. Aronia berry doesn't play along with that storyline. It doesn't need optimization. It doesn't benefit from isolation. In many cases, attempts to improve it actually make it less effective. That's a problem. Because once you accept that some things work best when left alone, you have to confront the uncomfortable idea that not all innovation is improvement. And that's not a popular message in an industry built on constant iteration. There's also an identity issue at play. Many people don't just consume supplements. They align with them. They build routines, beliefs, and even social circles around certain health philosophies. When a bitter, unglamorous berry shows up and quietly delivers results without requiring allegiance, it threatens more than sales. It threatens certainty. It is much easier to defend a product you buy every month than to admit a simple food might have been enough all along. This is why silence becomes the preferred strategy. Aronia berry isn't loudly criticized because criticizing it would require engaging with the evidence. It isn't celebrated either because celebration would require explanation. And explanation invites comparison. Comparison invites questions. And questions lead people away from easy purchases. So instead, aronia stays in the background. Known, but not promoted. Acknowledged, but rarely emphasized. Mentioned in academic circles, then quietly set aside when the conversation turns commercial. Another layer of discomfort comes from how aronia makes people feel over time. Not stimulated, not boosted. Not artificially energized, just steadier, more resilient, less inflamed. And that subtlety works against it in a culture addicted to instant feedback. People are conditioned to expect health interventions to announce themselves. A rush, a sensation, a clear before and after moment. Aronia berry doesn't do that. It works in the background, supporting systems rather than hijacking them. And because of that, it doesn't create dramatic testimonials or viral transformations. But here's the irony. The absence of drama is often the sign that something is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. There's also a deeper psychological resistance to bitterness itself. Bitter flavors historically signaled medicinal value. Our ancestors associated bitterness with potency and restraint. Modern food culture flipped that script. Sweetness became comfort. Bitterness became something to mask, neutralize, or avoid. Aronia didn't get that memo. You don't snack on aronia berry absent-mindedly. You don't eat it for entertainment. You eat it with awareness. And that alone makes it incompatible with a system designed around overconsumption and constant novelty. Then there's the issue of control. Pills centralize authority. They tell you exactly how much to take, when to take it, and why. Whole plants require judgment. They ask you to listen to your body, adjust amounts, and pay attention to patterns over time. That shifts responsibility away from labels and back onto individuals. And industries rarely benefit when people feel empowered instead of dependent. This is where the conversation usually gets uncomfortable for people who've invested years chasing optimization. Because once you accept that something simple can be effective, you have to confront how much effort, money, and energy went into chasing things that didn't deliver proportionally better outcomes. That realization doesn't feel good. So it's often avoided. What makes aronia berry especially inconvenient is that it doesn't demand belief. It doesn't require faith in proprietary blends or secret formulas. Its value shows up gradually, predictably, and without fanfare. And because of that, it doesn't need defenders. It just needs time. Time is something marketing can't compress. There's a reason traditional food cultures treated certain plants with respect rather than enthusiasm. They understood that the most powerful tools don't need constant reinforcement. They become part of the background, quietly supporting health while life happens around them. Aronia fits that pattern almost too well for modern tastes. And this brings us to a final, uncomfortable truth. When a plant works without asking you to believe in it, subscribe to it, or evangelize it, it disrupts an entire ecosystem built on persuasion. It doesn't create urgency. It doesn't create fear. It doesn't create dependency. It simply works. That's why aronia berry doesn't make headlines. That's why it doesn't dominate store shelves. And that's why it makes people uncomfortable, not because it threatens health, but because it threatens narratives. This is where the conversation stops being academic and starts getting personal, because almost everyone who's been around health, nutrition, or wellness long enough carries a quiet list of regrets, bottles they bought with high hopes, protocols they followed religiously, trends they defended online, only to abandon months later when nothing really changed. And here's the part that needs to be said clearly. Most people didn't make those choices because they were careless or uninformed. They made them because they were trying to do the right thing. They wanted to be proactive. They wanted to stay ahead of problems instead of reacting to them. They wanted to feel like they were investing in their future. That motivation is genuine. The system that exploits it is not. What usually happens is subtle. Someone hears about antioxidants, inflammation, aging, or cellular damage. They learn just enough to feel concerned, but not enough to feel grounded. And into that gap steps an endless parade of solutions, each one framed as essential. Each one positioned as the missing piece. Each one implying that if you don't take it, you're falling behind. So people start stacking. One supplement for antioxidants, one for inflammation, one for energy, one for longevity. One because a podcast guest said it changed their life. None of them dangerous on their own, but together they create a fog. Too many variables, too many inputs, no clear feedback loop. When something improves, you don't know why. When nothing improves, you assume you just haven't found the right product yet. That's not a failure of discipline. That's a failure of clarity. I've seen this play out countless times. People with shelves full of half-used bottles. People who rotate brands every few months. Convinced the previous one stopped working. People who mistake novelty for progress and complexity for intelligence. And slowly, almost invisibly, the original goal feeling better, more resilient, more stable gets buried under routines that are harder to maintain than they are to benefit from. This is where whole plants like aronia berry quietly disrupt the entire narrative. They don't promise optimization. They don't claim to hack anything. They don't offer instant feedback or dramatic sensations. And because of that, they force a different kind of engagement, one based on consistency, not excitement. On observation, not belief. When people finally simplify when they remove 5 things and add one dense, functional food, the difference is often uncomfortable at first. There's no rush, no obvious signal that something is working. But over time, patterns emerge. Recovery feels smoother, energy becomes steadier instead of spiky. Inflammation doesn't announce itself as loudly. You start noticing what isn't happening anymore. And that's a strange adjustment for people trained to expect fireworks. One of the hardest lessons people learn, often years too late, is that most real health improvements are subtractive, not additive. They come from removing noise, not adding more inputs. They come from letting systems stabilize instead of constantly stimulating them. This is why so many people don't realize how much money they've wasted until they stop spending it. It's only after stepping away from constant supplementation that the contrast becomes clear. That sense of chasing something that never quite arrives. That low-level anxiety of wondering whether you're missing the next big thing. That quiet frustration of doing everything right and still feeling off. Whole foods don't feed that anxiety. They don't create urgency. They don't position themselves as saviors. They just exist, waiting to be used consistently enough for their effects to matter. There's also an ego component nobody likes to talk about. Admitting that a simple bitter berry might outperform years of expensive experimentation doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels humbling. It forces a re-evaluation of choices that once felt smart. And humility is not something the wellness industry encourages, because humility doesn't sell. But it does liberate. When people let go of the need to optimize everything, they often discover that their bodies respond better to less intervention, not more. That health isn't a puzzle with infinite missing pieces, but a system that works best when it's supported instead of micromanaged. This is where Aronia berry earns its place, not as a miracle, but as a filter. It filters out hype. It filters out impatience. It filters out the belief that progress must always feel dramatic. And what's left is something much more useful: reliability. That reliability doesn't show up in before and after photos. It shows up in how often you think about your health, which is usually less. It shows up in how rarely you feel like you're falling behind. It shows up in the absence of constant experimentation. And here's the part most people only realize after years in the trenches. The goal was never to find the strongest thing on paper. The goal was to find something strong enough that you'd actually stick with it. Something that didn't demand faith, excitement, or constant reinforcement. Something that fit into life instead of trying to dominate it. That's why so many people who finally commit to dense whole plants stop searching shortly after. Not because curiosity disappears, but because the need to chase fades. The baseline improves. The noise quiets down. And health stops feeling like a full-time job. If you've ever looked at your shelf and wondered how it got so crowded, you're not behind. You're right on schedule. Almost everyone has to go through that phase before they realize that more effort doesn't always mean better results. Sometimes the biggest upgrade isn't discovering something new. It's finally listening to what's been working quietly the whole time. By this point, a pattern should be starting to feel uncomfortably clear. Not as a theory, not as a philosophy, but as something that explains a lot of past frustration. Because once you strip away the marketing, the trends, the expert hot takes, and the endless next big thing, the rules of what actually works become almost boringly consistent. And that's the problem. Boring doesn't sell. The boring works. What actually matters in long-term health has very little to do with intensity and almost everything to do with alignment. Alignment with human biology. Alignment with consistency. Alignment with behaviors you can repeat without needing motivation, hype, or external validation. The moment something requires constant excitement to maintain, it's already on borrowed time. This is where people get misled. They're taught to chase peak experiences. Stronger antioxidants, higher dosages, faster results, more optimization. But the body doesn't reward peak chasing, it rewards stability. It rewards inputs that it recognizes, understands, and knows how to work with over time. Dense whole plants like Aronia berry fit that model almost too perfectly. They don't overwhelm the system. They don't hijack pathways. They don't force outcomes. They provide information chemical signals the body evolved alongside, and then they get out of the way. That's what makes them effective. Most of what people think worked for them in the past didn't actually work because it was strong. It worked because it was new. Novelty creates attention. Attention creates perception. Perception creates belief. And belief can temporarily override awareness. But novelty always wears off, and when it does, the underlying effectiveness is exposed. This is why so many people feel like supplements stopped working. They didn't stop working. They were never doing much to begin with. The excitement just faded. What actually moves the needle rarely announces itself. It shows up as fewer bad days, quicker recovery from stress, less background inflammation that used to feel normal, energy that doesn't spike and crash, progress that feels almost invisible until you look back and realize something fundamental has shifted. And that's not exciting content. It's not a transformation reel. It's not a testimonial headline, but it's real. Another hard truth is that most people don't need more inputs. They need fewer contradictions. One supplement says take it with food. Another says take it fasted. One stimulates. Another calms. One works through one pathway. Another competes with it. And suddenly the body is juggling signals instead of responding to them. Whole foods don't do that. They send coherent messages. Complex, yes, but coherent. That coherence is why they've remained relevant across cultures and centuries while trends come and go. This is also where the obsession with replacement becomes misguided. People ask, what can I swap this for? Instead of what can I remove? They look for equivalents instead of anchors. But anchors are what matter. Things you can build around. Things that don't require constant decision-making. Aronia berry works not because it's exotic or rare, but because it's dense enough to justify its place without demanding attention. You don't need to think about it every day. You don't need to defend it. You don't need to explain it to anyone. You just use it consistently and let time do what hype never could. This brings us to one of the most misunderstood ideas in modern health: value. Value is not how much something costs. It's how much mental energy it consumes relative to what it gives back. $40 pills that require research, tracking, cycling, and replacement are expensive even if the price seems manageable. A bitter berry that quietly integrates into your routine and stops you from searching for the next solution is cheap, even if it takes effort to get used to. That shift from cost to value is what separates people who stay stuck in optimization loops from people who actually settle into sustainable health. There's also something deeply grounding about choosing inputs that don't need defending. When you're no longer emotionally invested in products, you become more observant. You start noticing how sleep affects you, how stress accumulates, how food combinations matter more than superfoods in isolation. And ironically, that awareness does more for health than any single intervention ever could. This is why the most effective people rarely sound extreme. They're not evangelists. They're not chasing absolutes. They're not arguing online. They've already filtered out what doesn't matter. They know that what works doesn't need constant reinforcement. And that's the final shift most people struggle to make. Letting go of the need to feel like they're doing something impressive. Letting go of the idea that health must always feel like effort. Letting go of the belief that progress has to be visible to be real. When you reach that point, dense whole foods stop being alternatives and start becoming foundations. And foundations don't compete for attention. They just hold everything else up. This is where everything we've talked about finally clicks into place, not as another idea to consider, but as a lens that permanently changes how you evaluate health decisions. Because once you see this clearly, it's almost impossible to go back to chasing hype the same way again. The biggest shift isn't switching from pills to plants. That's just a surface-level change. The real shift is learning how to tell the difference between something that sounds effective and something that behaves effectively over time. Most people evaluate health tools the wrong way. They ask, what's the strongest? Or, what's the most advanced? Or, what's everyone talking about right now? Those questions feel logical, but they quietly bias you toward novelty, complexity, and marketing momentum. They keep you reactive instead of grounded. People who actually win long-term ask a different question. What still works when nobody is talking about it? That question filters out almost everything that's built on excitement alone. Trends collapse under it. Influencer stacks fall apart. Expensive protocols lose their shine. What remains are simple inputs that continue delivering value quietly, without demanding attention or belief. This is where Aronia berry finally makes sense, not as a star, but as a reference point. It's not important because it's the most powerful thing on paper. It's important because it reveals how distorted the conversation has become. When a dense, bitter, unglamorous plant can outperform celebrated options without ever needing a marketing push, It exposes how often popularity and effectiveness have been confused. Once you internalize that, you stop being impressed by complexity. You start noticing how often advanced really means hard to evaluate. Often high prices exist to compensate for weak real-world results. How often people defend products more passionately than outcomes. And something else changes too. You stop looking for certainty from external authorities. You stop needing constant reassurance that you're doing the right thing. Instead, you build a small set of anchors, foods, habits, routines that consistently make your baseline better. And once the baseline improves, everything else becomes easier to judge. This is why experienced people sound boring when they talk about health. They're not chasing peaks anymore. They're protecting valleys. They care less about maximizing performance and more about minimizing breakdowns. They value resilience over optimization. That mindset doesn't just change what you consume. It changes how you think. You become skeptical of urgency. You become cautious of anything framed as indispensable. You recognize that real health rarely creates panic. Panic is a sales tool, not a biological signal. And here's the part that often surprises people. Once you stop chasing, you actually get better results. Because the body responds best to environments it can predict. Consistent inputs, familiar signals, rhythms that don't change every month. Whole plants like aronia berry work not because they overwhelm the system, but because they become part of that predictability. They don't compete for dominance, they integrate. That integration is what people feel when they say, "I don't know exactly when it started working, but I notice when it's gone." That sentence should mean more to you than any testimonial ever could. It signals that something moved from intervention to foundation. And foundations are where real progress lives. This is also where myth-busting becomes almost effortless. You stop arguing about whether something is better or worse in isolation. You start asking whether it earns a permanent place in your life without negotiation. Whether it reduces friction instead of adding to it. Whether it makes you calmer, not more anxious, about missing a dose or breaking a routine. Most products fail that test. Aronia berry passes it quietly. And that's why it doesn't need defending. It doesn't need evangelists. It doesn't need you to believe in it harder. It just needs time and consistency, two things marketing can't manufacture. So here's the final truth bomb, and this is the one most people miss until far too late. Health isn't about finding the best thing. It's about finding a few good things and stopping the search. The search itself is what exhausts people. The constant evaluation. The endless comparison. The low-level fear of missing out on the next breakthrough. When that stops, stress drops. Decision fatigue disappears. And ironically, health improves simply because the system is no longer under constant pressure. That's the real upgrade. Not a pill, not a protocol, not a superfood label. A way of thinking that makes most of the noise irrelevant. If there's one takeaway to carry forward, it's this. When something works quietly, without demanding belief, attention, or allegiance, pay closer attention, not less. Because the things that truly last rarely announce themselves. They just keep working. At this point, it should be obvious that the reason this plant never went mainstream has nothing to do with effectiveness. If anything, its effectiveness is the problem. Because popularity in the modern wellness world isn't awarded to what works best, it is awarded to what fits the system best. And aronia berry never did. To understand why, you have to understand how health trends actually spread in the US. They don't start with farmers, researchers, or long-term users. They start with incentives. Something has to be easy to brand, easy to sweeten, easy to standardize, and easy to turn into a repeat purchase. It has to photograph well. It has to taste pleasant enough to not scare first-time buyers. And most importantly, it has to create dependency, not biologically, but psychologically. Aronia fails almost every one of those tests. It's bitter, aggressively bitter. Not acquired taste, bitter honest, mouth-drying, no apologies bitter. That alone disqualifies it from mass appeal. Americans have been conditioned to associate bitterness with danger or defect, not nutrition. We were trained out of that tolerance generations ago. It also doesn't scale cleanly. You can't just strip one compound, throw it into a capsule, and call it a day without losing what makes it valuable. The strength is in the whole matrix, and that's inconvenient. Whole matrices don't patent well. They don't isolate well. They don't generate flashy charts or clean marketing claims. And then there's the biggest issue of all. Aronia doesn't create a problem it conveniently solves. Most successful wellness products subtly convince you that you are lacking something specific and that only their product addresses it. They fragment health into symptoms, then sell solutions one piece at a time. Energy here. Focus there. Immunity somewhere else. The consumer stays busy, concerned, and buying. Aronia doesn't play that game. It doesn't target a single buzzword outcome. It doesn't promise immediate sensations. It doesn't spike energy or suppress appetite or optimize anything dramatically enough to be felt in the short term. It just supports systems quietly and broadly. That's not a pitch. That's a liability. This is why it never got celebrity endorsements. Why it never became a TikTok trend. Why it never turned into a candy-flavored powder with neon packaging. You can't turn something like this into entertainment without fundamentally changing it, and once you change it, it stops being what made it valuable. Another uncomfortable reason it stayed obscure is that it doesn't make people feel special. Modern wellness thrives on identity. Keto people, biohackers, supplement stackers, superfood hunters. Every trend creates a tribe, and every tribe creates loyalty. Aronia doesn't give you a badge. There's no club, no lingo, no social payoff. You don't post about it. You don't argue about it. You don't convert others. You just use it. And for an industry built on engagement, that's useless. There's also a historical layer most people never hear about. Aronia wasn't discovered by modern wellness culture. It was used quietly for generations in regions that didn't export their habits well. Indigenous communities and Eastern European populations didn't frame it as a miracle. They treated it as a staple, something you respected, not something you hyped. When something enters the American market without a miracle narrative, it gets ignored. Because here, usefulness alone is rarely enough. And this brings us to a key realization. Obscurity is not always accidental. Sometimes it's structural. The system selects against things that reduce dependency, simplify choices, or make people less reactive. Those things don't keep attention cycles spinning. So when you ask, why didn't I hear about this sooner? The answer isn't ignorance, it's filtration. You weren't supposed to. The loudest things rise to the top, not the most effective ones. The most effective ones often sink beneath the noise because they don't generate momentum. They generate stability. And stability doesn't trend. This is why people who finally incorporate something like Aronia Berry often describe a strange feeling afterward. Not excitement, but relief. Relief from searching. Relief from tweaking. Relief from feeling behind. And that relief is dangerous to an industry that survives on dissatisfaction. So no, this plant was never meant to be popular. It was meant to be used. And those two things rarely overlap. Finding something better is rarely the hard part. Letting go of what felt productive but never really moved the needle, that's where most people stall. Because habits don't just live in behavior, they live in identity. And once health choices become part of how you see yourself, changing them can feel like losing ground, even when you're clearly gaining clarity. This is the quiet trap almost no one talks about. People don't cling to ineffective routines because they're stupid. They cling to them because those routines once gave them a sense of control. Tracking supplements, timing doses, reading labels, comparing studies, watching reviews. All of that creates the feeling of progress, even when results are minimal. It feels like you're doing something serious, something disciplined, something responsible. Walking away from that can feel irresponsible at first. When someone replaces a complex stack with a simple, bitter plant like Aronia berry, there's often an internal resistance that has nothing to do with evidence. It feels too easy, too low effort, too quiet. And quiet doesn't match the story most people have been told about improvement. Improvement is supposed to be visible, measurable, shareable. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of that effort was never for the body. It was for the mind. The mind likes novelty. It likes stimulation. It likes feedback loops. The body, on the other hand, prefers predictability. It wants the same signals at the same times. It wants inputs it recognizes. It wants consistency more than intensity. When those two preferences clash, people usually side with the mind and then wonder why results plateau. Letting go means accepting that some of the things you were doing weren't helping as much as you hoped. And that can bruise the ego, especially if you invested time, money, and belief into them. There's a sunk cost effect in wellness that keeps people stuck far longer than they should be. You see it all the time. Someone defends a supplement harder than they can explain how it actually changed their life. Someone keeps buying the same product because it worked before, even though they can't point to any concrete difference anymore. Someone keeps tweaking variables because stopping would feel like giving up, but stopping isn't giving up. It's graduating. The people who actually make long-term progress aren't the ones doing the most. They're the ones who've removed the most noise. They've learned to tolerate the discomfort of simplicity. They've learned to trust slow signals over loud promises. This is why the transition phase is often the hardest. When you remove the hype-driven habits, there's a temporary void. No new research to chase. No shiny purchase to anticipate. No protocol to refine. And in that space, people sometimes panic. They mistake calm for stagnation. That's when many relapse back into complexity. But if you sit in that space long enough, something else happens. You start noticing your baseline. You become more sensitive to how sleep affects you, how stress accumulates, how food quality matters more than macros. You begin to feel patterns instead of chasing fixes. And once that awareness sharpens, you realize how little most of the old habits were contributing. This is where aronia berry plays an interesting role, not as a replacement for everything, but as a stabilizer during the letting go phase. It gives you something solid without demanding obsession. It doesn't fill the void with excitement. It fills it with continuity. That continuity helps retrain trust. You stop asking, is this doing enough? And start noticing, I'm not crashing like I used to. You stop chasing spikes and start valuing smoothness. And slowly, your definition of progress matures. Another belief that has to be released is the idea that health improvements must always feel like effort. That if something doesn't challenge you, it must not be working. That mindset comes from fitness culture bleeding into nutrition and supplementation. But biological support isn't a workout, it's maintenance. Maintenance is quiet. Maintenance is repetitive. Maintenance is boring. And maintenance is what keeps systems functioning. This is also where people misunderstand discipline. Discipline isn't adding more rules. It's choosing fewer, better ones and following them without negotiation. Drinking a bitter juice consistently takes more real discipline than cycling through exciting products whenever motivation spikes. Once you internalize that, the need to constantly do something fades. You become comfortable doing the right thing, even when it doesn't feel dramatic. That comfort is a skill. And like any skill, it takes practice. The final habit that needs to be released is comparison. Watching what others are doing. Measuring your choices against trends. Feeling behind because you're not trying the newest thing. That comparison keeps people externally focused. It robs them of the ability to evaluate what's actually working for them. When you step away from that, your health decisions become calmer, more personal, less reactive, and ironically, more effective. So if this section feels uncomfortable, that's a good sign. It means you're brushing up against the real barrier, not access to information, but willingness to simplify. Once you let go of the habits that kept you busy but stuck, there's a natural question that follows. What replaces them? Because removing noise without installing structure just creates drift. And drift is how people quietly slide back into trends, stacks, and shortcuts the moment something new shows up. This section is about building a framework that holds one that doesn't crack every time a headline promises a breakthrough or a creator swears they've found the missing piece. The key thing to understand is that strong frameworks aren't built on rules. They're built on filters. Rules are fragile. They require enforcement. They break under stress. Filters, on the other hand, work automatically. They don't care how persuasive something sounds. They don't care how popular it is. They simply screen things out before they ever become tempting. People who stay grounded in their health don't rely on willpower. They rely on standards. Here's the first filter that actually matters. Does this reduce complexity or add to it? Most hype fails instantly here. New supplements add timing requirements. New protocols add tracking. New discoveries add anxiety about what you're missing. Even when they work marginally, they raise cognitive load, and that cost compounds over time. Whole plants like aronia berry pass this filter because they simplify decisions. There's no debate, no stacking, no cycling. They don't force you to redesign your day around them. They integrate instead of intruding. The second filter is even more powerful. Would this still make sense if nobody talked about it for the next 5 years? This is where trends collapse. If something relies on constant discussion to stay appealing, it's not stable. Real foundations don't need reminders. They become invisible parts of your routine. Ask yourself honestly, if all the podcasts, videos, and posts disappeared tomorrow, would this still earn a place in your life? Most products don't survive that question, The third filter is biological humility. Does this work with the body or try to override it? A lot of modern health tools are about forcing outcomes. Forcing energy, forcing focus, forcing recovery. And while that can be useful short-term, forced systems always collect a debt. The body compensates. Sensitivity dulls. Side effects appear. What once felt powerful becomes necessary just to feel normal. Dense whole foods don't force, they support. They nudge systems in directions the body already recognizes. That's why their effects feel subtle at first and why they hold up over time. This is where people misjudge effectiveness. They confuse felt immediately with worked deeply. But deep work in biology often feels boring in real time. Once you apply these filters consistently, something interesting happens. Your decision-making bandwidth opens up. You're no longer evaluating everything. Most things disqualify themselves automatically. And that creates space not just mentally, but physiologically. Stress drops, cortisol patterns normalize. Sleep improves. Not because of a product, but because of fewer contradictions. This is the hidden advantage of a strong framework. It reduces internal friction. Another element of a durable framework is redundancy, not in products but in benefits. People often stack multiple supplements to target the same outcome through different mechanisms, thinking more angles equals more results. In reality, it often equals interference. Whole plants like aronia berry are naturally redundant. Multiple compounds, overlapping pathways, built-in balance. That redundancy is evolutionary, not engineered. And because it's organic, it doesn't compete with itself. This is why cultures that relied on whole foods rarely have protocols. They have patterns, seasonal habits, repeated practices, food as infrastructure, not intervention. When you adopt that mindset, health stops being a project and starts being an environment. You're not constantly fixing problems. You're maintaining conditions where fewer problems arise. And that brings us to distraction detection, the final piece most people overlook. Distractions rarely announce themselves as distractions. They arrive framed as upgrades, as optimizations, just-in-case additions. They exploit curiosity and insecurity simultaneously. And if your framework is weak, they slip right in. But with strong filters in place, distractions become obvious. You start noticing when something is trying to create urgency without necessity, when it demands attention without offering stability, when it promises results but requires constant adjustment. At that point, saying no doesn't feel like deprivation. It feels like protection. That's the goal, not restriction, but insulation. A framework like this doesn't make you rigid. It makes you selective. It allows you to experiment without destabilizing your foundation. You can test things, drop them, move on without resetting your entire system every time. And that's the difference between people who dabble forever and people who settle into something that actually works. To really understand why something like aronia berry feels almost suspicious to an American audience, you have to step back and look at cultural conditioning. Not marketing tactics, not bad actors, but the deeper story the US has been telling itself for decades about progress, value, and improvement. In the United States, better has almost always meant newer. Newer technology, newer formulas, newer research, newer breakthroughs. We're taught implicitly and explicitly that advancement comes from replacement, not refinement. If something is old, simple, or unchanged, the assumption is that it's incomplete, that it's waiting to be upgraded. This mindset works incredibly well in tech. It works in manufacturing. It works in entertainment. It does not work well in biology. Human biology doesn't update every year. Our digestive systems, stress responses, inflammatory pathways, and circadian rhythms are operating on timelines measured in thousands of years, not quarterly earnings cycles. But American health culture treats the body like software, something that just needs the latest patch. That disconnect creates a constant low-grade dissatisfaction. People feel like whatever they're doing is temporary by default. They assume a better option is coming soon. So they never fully commit to what they have. They hover above habits instead of settling into them, and that hovering prevents depth. This is why Americans often struggle with bitter foods. Bitterness signals complexity. It signals this is doing something you don't immediately enjoy. And in a culture trained to equate pleasure with value, that's a problem. Sweetness is easy to sell. Smoothness is reassuring. Anything that requires adaptation feels outdated or unnecessary. But bitterness has always been associated with medicinal density in traditional cultures. It slows consumption. It commands respect. It tells the body to pay attention. When you remove bitterness from a diet entirely, you don't just lose flavor, you lose a signaling mechanism. Aronia berry violates American taste expectations at a fundamental level. It doesn't flatter the palate. It challenges it. And culturally, challenge is something we expect from workouts or careers, not from food. There's also the American obsession with immediacy. If something doesn't produce a noticeable effect quickly, it's labeled ineffective. Never mind whether that effect is meaningful or sustainable. The feeling matters more than the outcome. This is why stimulants thrive and stabilizers get ignored. Whole plants rarely give you fireworks. They give you fewer crashes, fewer extremes, more tolerance to stress. Those benefits don't photograph well, they don't make good testimonials. And they don't trigger the reward circuits that keep people engaged. So they get dismissed. Another layer is the American relationship with authority. People trust institutions selectively. They distrust government. They distrust corporations. They distrust experts. But they still want permission. So they look for validation through popularity. If enough people are doing something, it must be safe. If enough influencers talk about it, it must be legitimate. This creates a paradox. Things that work quietly but lack visibility feel risky. Things that are everywhere feel trustworthy, even when outcomes are mediocre. The crowd becomes a proxy for evidence. Aronia berry doesn't benefit from that dynamic. It doesn't flood shelves. It doesn't dominate search results. It doesn't have a mascot or a movement. So it feels like a gamble, even though historically it's the opposite. In many parts of the world, what's rare is novelty, not tradition. Stability is valued. Foods that endure across generations earn trust precisely because they haven't changed. In the US, endurance is often mistaken for stagnation. That inversion shapes everything. It's why people are more comfortable experimenting endlessly than committing deeply. Why they'd rather try 10 supplements briefly than one food consistently. Why simplicity feels like settling instead of refining. And this is where suspicion creeps in. When something is cheap, unflashy, and effective, Americans subconsciously ask, what's the catch? Because we're used to value being hidden behind complexity. We expect effort to be rewarded with results. When results arrive without drama, it feels unearned. But biology doesn't care about cultural narratives. It responds to inputs, patterns, and time. And time is the variable American culture struggles with the most. We're excellent at acceleration, terrible at patience. This is why reframing is essential. Simple doesn't mean primitive. Bitter doesn't mean broken. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Old doesn't mean obsolete. These associations are cultural, not biological. Once you separate the two, a lot of confusion dissolves. You start realizing that many of the things Americans chase are compensations for instability, energy spikes to offset poor sleep, supplements to offset inconsistent diets, hacks to offset stress-heavy lifestyles. Whole plants don't compensate, they stabilize. And stabilization reduces the need for hacks. That's threatening to a system built on perpetual dissatisfaction. So if you've ever felt strangely resistant to something simple, even when it makes sense on paper, understand this. That resistance isn't intuition. It's conditioning. And once you see it, you can step outside it.